Welcome, everybody. On behalf of Provost Sally Kornbluth and President Price, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this keynote talk. I'm Ravi Bellamkonda. I have the honor and privilege to introduce today's keynote speaker, Kristof, and welcome him to Duke. As many of you know, Mr. Kristof is a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the New York Times and a staunch defender of immigrants and for an advocate for a more open and humane immigration policy. He's lived on 4 continents, reported on 6, and traveled to more than 150 countries. It is safe to say that Mr. Kristof has seen more of the human condition than most, and some of these sites have not necessarily reflected the best in humanity. He's covered wars, warlords, and has even witnessed, I'm told, a mob carrying heads on a pile, on pikes. Despite this, what makes him very special in my eyes is that he carries an unwavering faith in the basic goodness and decency of all people. No matter the color of their skin, their religious beliefs, or country of origin, Mr. Kristof has been and continues to be a relentless advocate for immigrants, human rights, and gives voice to the voiceless, and in the process, he often asks us to examine our own humanity. Mr. Kristof's passion for this work is inspired at least partially by his own family. His father was himself a refugee with a nearly unpronounceable name. I'll take a shot. Vladislav Kristofowicz. This is, after all, Coach K country. I should take a shot. And no money in his pocket. His father escaped Romania to the United States and then changed his name to Ladis Kristof. He had a thick accent, he learned to speak English, but he thrived with his hard work and the kindness of strangers, and eventually became a university professor at Portland State University. Now, some of you may be wondering why the engineering dean is introducing Mr. Kristof, and I'd like to share with you that there's a faint echo, if you will, of Mr. Ladis Kristof's story in my own journey here. I came here 30 years ago as a 21-year-old. I had $800 and a scholarship, and someone took a chance on me, someone who had never met me. When I first came here, I stayed with 2 German brothers who had never met before, 2 computer scientists, Marcus and Matthias Floka, who were kind enough, never asked me how long I'd be with them. I ate their cereal and all of that stuff. So, I eventually found a roommate who helped me out and helped pay him back over time for the apartment deposit that we had to put down. 30 years later, like Ladis Kristof, I'm now a university professor and American citizen. These stories are emblematic of the kindness and the attitude towards immigrants that have shaped this country for hundreds of years. I believe that this welcoming spirit remains strong, despite beliefs and actions of some that, in the words of Mr. Kristof, have left a series of stains in our history. The American idea, I believe, and the ideal is strong. And it is not okay for us to cede what that idea is or becomes to people who have less noble or generous interpretations of what our spirit is capable of taking in. So Mr. Kristof has been and remains a very prominent and important voice, magnifying perhaps the quieter voices in our classrooms of our students in the audience and the scholars at Duke and places like Duke. And he's helping shape this next chapter, this unwritten chapter of what America is and what it becomes. So please join me in welcoming Nicholas Kristof to Duke as he speaks to us about immigration as a test of our values. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ravi. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ravi. I am delighted to be here again, back at Duke. I know I have a bunch of friends in the audience. I can't entirely see you, but to those old friends who are here, hello. And how has the conference been going so far? Yeah? You know, that was a little bit anemic, just a little bit. I know that Duke is capable of strong pride, I think, so I hear. So how has the conference been going so far? You know, one of the I'm kind of embarrassed to tell this story, but one of the reasons that I know that Duke is capable of strong pride is that on my first visit here, I was speaking about Darfur. It was the early 2000s, and it was winter, it was basketball season. And so I just made some light offhand. I thought I'd, ask a question to get everybody unified, and I said, so what's the best basketball team in the country? And, I figured everybody's going to Duke and cheer, and we're all, happily together on the same page. Well, it so turned out that a bunch of UNC people had come over and were in the audience. And so all of a sudden there were some dissonant chords in the response. And here I am speaking about genocide. I almost brought a genocide to Duke. And so I am not going to ask any questions about relative merits of different universities today. But I am really glad to be at this conference, partly because it does reflect an engagement with a really important issue of a kind that I think it's very important for universities to perform. I think of universities as great public goods, and to encourage students to engage with issues like this is so important. One of my fears, actually, in this country is that we will become so focused just on impeachment over the next, and then the election over the next year or so, that issues like immigration, other international issues may get shunted aside. And I think it's very important that obviously this is a historic moment in terms of the impeachment investigation, but that it's also important for us not to lose sight of other issues like immigration. And that's because this is not only a policy question, it's not only about migrants, it's also very much about us. It's a test of our values, of our communities, of how we will be remembered. And so let me start with a little bit of that, just a brief walk through some of the history of migration to try to frame the context. One strain of our history is the Statue of Liberty and a historic openness toward immigrants from much of the world. The famous Emma Lazarus saying, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." And so that is one very important strain in American history. But then, of course, there's another strain that is also an antecedent to some of the conflicts that we're encountering today, and that is a strain, if you will, of xenophobia. Let me ask, how many of you here today either were born abroad or have at least one parent who was born abroad? How many of you, in addition to those who had at least one parent born abroad, how many of you have at least one grandparent born abroad? We, I think, sometimes forget how much antagonism and animosity those earlier waves of immigration aroused as well, for reasons that in many ways are parallel to the anxiety that immigration today has aroused. In the 19th, this is a church being burned in Philadelphia in anti-Catholic riots in 1844. There were waves of such riots in many cities. Then you had famously "No Irish Need Apply" signs, a part of the same wave of hostility towards Catholics and immigrants. The Chinese were banned under the Exclusion Acts of 1888. And in the Southwest in particular, there were a lot of lynchings of Mexicans and Mexican Americans that we tend not to know so much about. Some 600 Mexicans or Mexican Americans were murdered through those lynchings in the Southwest. And so when today a president refers to Mexicans as rapists and murderers, that is a offspring of a long tradition of resentment and bigotry and antagonism. Then, of course, in the run-up to World War II, we had the internment of Japanese Americans, endorsed by good liberals like Earl Warren, among others. Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the few people to really speak out against it, bless her soul. The New York Times, I looked back to see how we had covered it, and we had a quite shameful article as Japanese Americans were being rounded up about how great the conditions were. It just made my blood freeze. But maybe the episode in our history that I find, in terms of migrants, immigration, particularly horrifying, it has to do with the Holocaust and the run-up to the Holocaust, when the U.S. Refused to take in large numbers of Jews who were desperate to come. And there was a quite vigorous debate about this in the U.S. After Kristallnacht in 1938, there was a poll in the U.S. that found that 94% of Americans disapproved of the Nazi treatment of Jews, but 72% still opposed taking in large numbers of Jews. And the reasons, in some ways, mirror the unwillingness to take in large numbers of Syrians or Hondurans today. There was a sense that this will hurt our economy, that they will take jobs from Americans, that we can't afford it, that they may present security risks, that we have to look after Americans first. And when I've written about this, readers have pushed back and said, well, Syrians today clearly present a security risk, while in the 1930s, European Jews clearly did not present a security risk. But that was not the perception at the time. And there were widespread fears that Jews fleeing Europe might be communists or might even be Nazi saboteurs in disguise. And the New York Times, actually, in 1938, we quoted the granddaughter of President U.S. Grant as warning about what she said so-called Jewish refugees. And she suggested that they were communists, quote, coming to this country to join the ranks of those who hate our institutions and want to overthrow them. As I look back at the coverage of these issues in the 19th and 20th centuries, it seems to me that journalists did too much to recklessly and sensationally inflame these kinds of fears and didn't do enough to humanize those whose lives were at stake. And so I think that today we in journalism have some moral obligation to be very, very careful not to exaggerate those risks, and in turn to humanize those who are trying to come to this country, trying to protect their families. And so let me personalize it a little bit more, still in the context of World War II. On April 30th, 1941, a Jewish man in Amsterdam wrote a desperate letter to an American friend, pleading for help coming to the U.S. He said, quote, USA is the only country we could go to. It is for the sake of the children mainly. Well, that plea got nowhere. And then in 2005, a volunteer was going through files in New York City and came across that letter, and it looked like so many others, but then she looked at the children's names and she said, "Oh my God, it's the Anne Frank file." It was the file of the letters that Otto Frank, Anne Frank's dad, had written to his American friends, trying desperately to get permission to emigrate to the US, to Cuba, or to the UK. He tried 3 times to come to the US. And in many ways, the Frank family had everything going to them. Otto Frank had actually lived in New York City on the Upper West Side as a young man. Anne Frank herself had studied English shorthand. They had a good friend who was working in the Roosevelt administration in a senior capacity. Even with all that going for them, they still could not get permission to come to the US. And we look back on that with shame, and I think someday we will look back at how we have treated Syrians and Central Americans with a similar sense of a stain on our honor. And let me say something about Central Americans in particular. And I think that Americans sometimes wonder how it is that families will send will travel across all of Mexico, undertake a dangerous journey, send children, and they think that parents are somehow being irresponsible. Let me introduce you to this family. The girl, the second from left, Elena, is 14, and she is why the family left. They're Hondurans. A gang leader decided that he wanted Elena to be his girlfriend, quote unquote. And Elena and the family, they knew what would happen if she said no, because just before this, the same gang leader had asked Elena's friend, Genesis, to be his girlfriend. She had declined very politely, and Elena had seen the result as Elena was staggering naked down the street after she had been gang raped and shot in the stomach. And so, of course, if you are Elena's family, you will want to flee and you will undertake risks. It's precisely because you love your children that you will want to find a new refuge for them. And the idea that we would risk sending Elena back to Honduras, back to that gang leader, just boggles my mind. It's also worth noting that while violence is a reason why some families flee Central America, another longer-term issue is one that we do bear some responsibility for, and that is climate change. And look, it's complicated, and it's often difficult to attribute any one drought to long-term climate change. But in Guatemala in particular, there has been a very substantial drought that corresponds to predictions about climate change. It's true that if there were better governance, that some of those could be mitigated and addressed, but that climate change is certainly one reason why people that drought is one major reason why people flee. I was in Guatemala recently, visited this family, that's Ana Jorge, and she understands as well as anybody the risks of trying to migrate north. Her husband, essentially because of a drought in their village near the Mexican border, the crops had failed. Her husband had then set out in a quite desperate effort to start over. Managed to get to the U.S. He reached Alabama. He worked cutting flowers. And then he died of an infection. And she didn't understand exactly what he had died of. But he passed away before the debts that he had accumulated that he had borrowed to go north had been fully paid. So now the family found itself in a desperate strait. It had these debts, and it wasn't getting any income. Anna had 3 children. 2 of them then died, apparently of malnutrition because of the difficulty feeding those kids in this crisis. The surviving child, Juan, is now 11 years old. She had to pull him out of school, actually, when he was back in the 2nd grade when this crisis happened, so that he could work in the fields and earn a little bit of money to help pay down these debts. So Juan, now at age 11, is talking himself about trying to head north to the U.S. And he does that because he says there's no future in this village. And Anna, even though she lost her husband on that same trip, even though she knows full well those dangers, she said that she was increasingly willing to let him go. And the way she put it was, food doesn't grow here anymore. That's why I would send my son north. Food doesn't grow here anymore. And that is, again, a reminder both of the fact that the decision to for people to migrate is not lightly made, is not glibly made. It's because people love their children that they sometimes take them north. And also that we do have a historical responsibility in some of these countries, either because of our role there or because of climate change. And I think one of the lessons of that history is that as a country, when we are scared, we often make bad decisions that we regret. And in World War II, it was because we were afraid of Japanese American saboteurs that we made this inexcusable decision to intern Japanese Americans. It was similar fears earlier of Chinese, of Irish, of Italians that led us to engage in racism and bigotry. And one lesson of that, I think, is that when people stoke fears today about caravans, about threats to American well-being and security, that we bear a special historical responsibility to look very, very closely at those claims, and that universities in particular perhaps have some special capacity and obligation to provide that kind of scrutiny and to bring some extra balance to those discussions and empathy for those seeking to find a respite. And I mention empathy because one of the lessons, again, is that we bar those who we feel less empathy for, whom we can otherize. We otherize people on the basis of race or religion or ethnicity or documentation. And when we otherize people, it becomes easier to engage in behaviors that we would never condone in other contexts. I was struck in the context of empathy that I was speaking recently to John Delaney, the Democratic candidate for president, who is not going very far very fast, which is why he wasn't on the debate stage the other night. But he was mentioning that his grandfather's family had come to the US from Italy, and that the rest of the family had all been admitted from Ellis Island, but the grandfather had only one arm. He had lost an arm in an accident. And so he was kept and told that he would have to be sent back to Italy. He was about 14 at the time. But there was an appeals process before a judge, and so he appealed, but it didn't look good. And then in walked the judge, and the judge only had one arm. And that's when the grandfather knew, I am going to be admitted, I'm going to be an American citizen. Because he knew that that judge would then have an empathy for somebody who had the same disability. And that challenge of having empathy, I think, is one that has to inform our immigration discussions as well. And look, there are legitimate debates to have about the trade-offs and about the policies that we have on immigration. I'm not in favor of open borders. I think that we do need secure borders, and I think we need to limit immigration. I think that there is a danger of affluent, well-educated Americans emphasizing just the advantages to the country of immigration without fully acknowledging that low-skilled, low-education workers can indeed face some competitive challenges from immigrants. And there's a big debate in the economic literature about how real that competition is. And in general, probably the consensus is that those concerns are overblown, but that there probably is indeed some downward pressure on wages for low-skilled workers, including those of recent immigrants themselves. And so, look, since the 1970s, low-skilled, low-education Americans have had a really tough time. And those households with people who have not graduated from high school are earning less today after inflation than they were in the late 1970s. They have fewer assets today. Suicide rates are at a 70-year high. We have a deep dysfunction in many of these communities, and I think we do have to be concerned about the impact of low-wage immigration. It's a legitimate concern to bear in mind as we calculate these trade-offs. And it's also worth noting, look, when Angela Merkel welcomed migrants after this boy's body, Alan Kurdi, was found on the beach, that photo rocketed around the world, then I was so impressed with Chancellor Merkel. I thought she had done absolutely the right thing, and I still do. But I also saw in reporting on migration to Europe that one consequence of her speech was that more people from Eritrea, from Nigeria, from South Sudan undertook incredibly dangerous journeys to try to get to Germany, often ending up in Libya in brutal circumstances, then crossing the Mediterranean. Many of them died there. And I was sobered about the risk of sending signals that lead people to take undertake very dangerous journeys. I was also, in retrospect, sobered by the way that Merkel's announcement and the wave of migration ended up empowering really extremist right-wing voices around Europe, and probably were a factor in Brexit as well. So again, I think that there are trade-offs and complexities here that originally I did not appreciate. But granted that there are lots of nuances, lots of legitimate debates to have. So here are some things we can do on the migration front that I think are genuinely helpful. You know, for starters, one thing we need to do is recognize that climate is going to be an increasingly important part of this. Over the next 50 years, climate-driven migration is going to be a much bigger part of migration. I've seen this in West Africa in particular. And to the extent that historically, so much of the carbon emissions that have taken place are coming from the U.S., I think we, again, bear a particular responsibility to try to address it. Another lesson is the importance of trying to improve governance. And this isn't a short-term fix any more than climate is, but where governments and societies are broken, then people are more likely to flee, whether it's because of violence or because of dysfunctional agriculture, whatever else. One thing we've seen, actually, is that El Salvador, in recent years, has improved governance, modestly with the help of the U.S., while Guatemala has arguably gone in the wrong direction, spiraled downward in terms of governance. And this is something where we at the we have real influence on these countries. We can force countries to address corruption so that money actually goes to help impoverished workers and farmers and not to line the pockets of politicians. We can help address gang violence. There have been some efforts in Honduras in particular to try to address gang violence to improve security, and those actually turned out to be reasonably effective. They weren't a silver bullet, but they were helpful. And, you know, look, there are no silver bullets here, but in a sense, they're silver buckshot. There are a lot of little things we can do that will collectively make some difference. In the same vein, helping agriculture, and that's going to be everything from providing drought-resistant crops to improving irrigation, improving yields, helping provide better markets for crops, giving people reasons to stay on the land, to find work, is always going to be cheaper than trying to provide for them in this country. And that should be driven not only by compassion, but out of an enlightened self-interest. We can do things in this country. There have been some steps on E-Verify in this country, but they have very much placed the burden on individual workers and not on employers. If we want to reduce incentives for people to come, then we can make E-Verify, put E-Verify burdens more on employers. But then we have to face the recognition that employers right now are desperate for workers, and that undocumented workers are absolutely critical to many sectors of the economy. And so if we as a country want to reduce access by undocumented people to those jobs, then we will also pay an economic price. But that is a decision that we should make at as a rational decision involving E-Verify and employer responsibilities, and not just put those burdens on the individual workers. We can also, in cases like Syrian refugees, look, at the end of the day, we are not going to solve the problem of Syrian refugees. The numbers whom we take are minimal in the overall scheme of things. But we can do a much, much better job, more cheaply, of helping Syrian refugees who are in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Jordan, and help support education provisions there so that those families can send their kids to school, for example. And that is far, far cheaper an investment than it is to bring people here. And it also then reduces the chance of another crisis a generation down the road where uneducated people, as a consequence of this crisis, are involved in some future crisis. But I'd also say that even though we aren't going to single-handedly solve that Syrian refugee crisis, we also do have a moral responsibility of leadership. And it really mattered when Canada, at the same time that the US was dramatically cutting refugee numbers, when Canada announced it was going to take more Syrian refugees. And then when Prime Minister Trudeau went to the airport to welcome those refugees and hand out winter coats to those refugees, it sent a signal around the world that these are people to be valued and not demonized. And we can't ask other countries to do their part when we refuse to do ours. And so there, too, we have a real responsibility. The Trump administration has proposed a couple of changes in immigration policy that strike me as actually reasonable. I say that with some surprise. But I think they're also worth considering. One is ending the policy to citizenship by birth, where the U.S. is something of an anomaly. My own family, 2 of our 3 kids were born abroad, and in neither country did they have access to citizenship. In much of the world, birth does not confer citizenship. One can argue that in an increasingly mobile age where people can fly, that we should rethink that. I don't have strong feelings, but it's certainly worth considering. And another is to move the U.S. more toward a Canadian or Australian kind of immigration system where it's based less on family relationships and more on qualifications, education, professional qualifications, to try to bring in more high-skilled workers so that the burden of immigration does not fall so much on low-skilled workers, but on society as a whole. That strikes me as also a reasonable reform over time to undertake. But while there are all these legitimate discussions one can have about immigration policy, about refugee policy, what has profoundly pained me over the last couple of years has been the way we haven't had that discussion. Instead, there's been a tendency to demonize immigrants and refugees, to see them through this prism of fear and danger that goes back to some of the grimmest periods of American history. And maybe the ugliest chapter of that was family separation. I wrote about a case of a 30-year-old El Salvadoran who was a college graduate who was on execution list, so he fled with his son, Mateo, to the U.S. They presented themselves legally at the border, asked for asylum, doing everything properly, legally, presented birth certificates, other documentation at the border, and sought asylum. And then they were put in a holding facility, and then a few days later, Mateo was ripped from his dad's arms as they were both crying. Mateo was 1 year old at that point. 1 year old child. Mateo was sent off to Texas to a foster home for 3 months. Mateo and his dad had almost no contact in that period. Kidnappers allow more contact with parents than the U.S. government did. And I find I found that policy of child separation just unconscionable, and particularly because the purpose of it seemed precisely to terrorize families and deter other parents from bringing their kids to the U.S. And also, while we're talking about family separation, let's just acknowledge that the larger issue is that while the worst part of family separation is now over. So it continues, but at a lower rate. Today, it's more of a problem of grandparents and grandkids being separated, or brothers and sisters being separated, somebody over 18 and somebody under 18 being separated, and less parents and kids, although it does continue, but at a lower rate. But the big problem we have with family separation is people who have come to the U.S., are undocumented, and then have kids in the U.S. who are American citizens. And then the parents are detained and sent abroad, while the kids who are American citizens are not. And by some estimates, that happens 30,000 times a year in the U.S. And those are American citizen kids who are separated because of these policies. It's a family separation policy we don't talk enough about. 30,000 a year. DACA. Here we have kids who are Americans in any recognizable way, and yet their status they are still in danger. A new Rhodes Scholar this year, for the first time, was a DACA recipient. He can't go off with his Rhodes classmates to Oxford because he might not be allowed back. That too should just embarrass and shame us. DACA students in some states aren't even allowed to attend state universities. This is us hurting ourselves in the long run. Now, why don't we have a more sensible and compassionate, more reasonable policy on immigration? I think we psych ourselves out in various ways. And again, I think it's, a university community is one that can help address these. One way is we talk about people who are illegal. Look, people are not illegal. Conduct may be, but people are not illegal. And many of these, Mateo and his dad, they entered perfectly legally, applying for asylum at the border. They did everything just right, and they still suffered. I don't think that is a proper excuse. And then there's this argument, this way we psych ourselves out. We say that, immigrants are a burden, that we have to take care of our own first. And again, this goes way back through American history. But one of the things we've seen is how much immigration has enriched us. You look at patents, you look at 1/3 of intellectual property in the U.S. comes from immigrants. Only 17% of the finalists in the 2016 Intel Science Talent Search were the children of U.S.-born parents. Immigration has been a huge benefit, and in the longer run, one of the challenges for so many industrialized countries has been lower fertility rates, and in the long run, a demographic challenge of a diminishing labor force. The U.S. has been largely immune to that problem, partly because of immigration. Immigration strengthens our long-term economic outlook. And the final way in which we psych ourselves out is the drop in the bucket argument, the notion that we can't help everybody, so, we should help nobody. And that strikes me as a complete fallacy. Now, in some ways, it's true. We're not going to solve the immigration problem globally. We can't take everybody. In that sense, perhaps what we do is a drop in the bucket, but I'm a believer in drops in the bucket, and it's partly because of this person, Vladislav Kristofovich, fled Eastern Europe, settled in France, was almost executed in Yugoslavia, settled in France, but thought that France wasn't fully accepting of refugees and began to dream of coming to the U.S. He explored an illegal marriage with an American citizen as a way to get to the U.S. He almost had it worked out. At the last minute, it collapsed. And then he was cleaning hotel rooms. He couldn't get a work permit. He was cleaning hotel rooms illegally. He met a young American working for the Marshall Plan, and she convinced her family and church to sponsor him to the U.S. He took a ship to the U.S. As it was approaching New York Harbor, there was an elderly Boston woman on the deck. He couldn't really speak English, but she spoke some French. They tried to communicate. She told him about the words on the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, the Emma Lazarus quote that I showed you earlier. She wrote them down for him. And then as the ship was docking, before she walked off, she said, "Welcome to America, young man." And then she corrected herself and said, "Welcome to America, young American." And he was just so flabbergasted that here he is coming from a continent that had been suffered these brutal wars because of nationalism, and he can't speak English, hasn't even set foot on U.S. soil, and he's already being called a young American, and he was deeply moved by that. So he then settled in the U.S. And look, this didn't solve the global refugee problem, didn't make a dent in the global refugee problem. There were reasons Americans could have feared an East European refugee in the height of the Cold War. Could he have been a saboteur, a spy? Yeah, he could have been. He was not. He, after coming to the U.S., he decided that the name Vladislav Kristofovich was completely unworkable in English. His last name had 3 Z's, and so he shortened it to Kristof, my dad. So take it from me, drops in the bucket, that is indeed how we can fill buckets. And that is something we can do to help immigration, to help humanize the larger issues, and at some level to do something that may not solve the problem for everyone, but is transformative for some families. Thanks very much for having me here.
We have time for questions. I would particularly encourage the students in the audience, if you'd like. There are mics in here. If you'd please come forward.
Hi. Thank you for this beautiful keynote. My name is Sarah. I'm an immigrant. I'm a Duke faculty. And I was just a little bit startled by what you said about some of Trump's idea, and you kind of considering them. What I mean is, I got a green card thanks to Duke sponsorship before Trump was elected. If that same process was to happen today, I could not have a green card. I have a master's, I have a PhD, I'm a tenured associate professor at Duke, and yet none of these things would qualify me under Trump's, proposed description of what a qualified immigrant to this country is. So I guess I would invite you and everybody else to actually maybe take a closer look at what these things mean.
And this is the distinction between using family ties versus the qualification ties?
Yes.
Yeah.
I am technically not qualified.
Yeah.
If I am not qualified, then I think very few people would be qualified to be here today.
Yeah, I mean, this is I think it's a legitimate discussion. It's Canada and Australia, as I say, have emphasized the educational qualification and professional qualification metrics. We've emphasized family ties, and there's good evidence to examine and discuss which helps the economy, which helps more people, and so on. And that's a perfectly valid discussion to have.
We'll go here and we'll alternate, if that's okay.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about that same section of your talk, but from a sort of different perspective, which is not people who are educated who don't make the cutoff, but the fact that the people who, I think a lot of people who have the most desperate need wouldn't qualify for programs like that, and might qualify for something through family ties or through another immigration program. But at the same time, of course, I understand the arguments that are there, so I wonder how you reconcile the sort of humanitarian and economic
Sure.
incentives there.
No, that's a good question. I'd make the distinction that refugee admissions are separate from the question of family ties versus qualifications. And I mean, refugees are really where the urgent need is, and they're indeed, I think that's all about. So this is really more of a question for other countries where need isn't so much of an issue. For example, in China, right now, immigration tends to come from Guangdong province in the south, and especially Taishan, now a city, formerly a county, which is historically where Chinese Americans originally came from 100 years ago, and so Taishan became the source of many of the families, and so the family ties, it tends to emphasize people from this one area. It's not obvious to me that we should continue today to be particularly admitting Taishan people as opposed to Sichuan people or people from the north of China or anywhere else. I don't think that's a need-based issue. I think the mic isn't working, or can you speak into it a little more?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm a student here, and I'm a sophomore. And last night, I actually went online, and I took like a draft version of the test that you had to take to see how many points you would have under the RAISE Act, Trump's new immigration policy. And I found out that filling out all of the variables for what a Duke graduate would reasonably have at the moment that they graduate, I scored 29 out of 30 points. I wouldn't be allowed to come here even as a Duke graduate, even as someone here on a merit scholarship. And to me, while I was looking through that test, it really struck me that so many of these questions are structured in ways that really parallel a lot of the other issues we face in society. And it made me realize that our conversation on immigration is actually a lot more complicated than simply a test of our values. I would say that when people say we can't have immigrants because they'll take our jobs, when we say we can't have immigrants because of overpopulation, I think what immigration ultimately becomes is a litmus test of the issues, the deep problems in our society that we don't have the political will to address directly. And so we imagine that reducing immigration is the solution to these problems. And by extension, immigrants are the problem. So what would you say to that?
I think that's very true. No, I think that's very true. I think it's sort of striking that in 1963 we passed a Civil Rights Act. In 64 we passed Civil Rights Act. 65 the Voting Rights Act, and how was it that a lot of white Americans around the country were willing to be a little bit more inclusive then? I think it's because there had been a long period of prosperity that was led people to be willing to risk being a little bit more inclusive at that time. And today, in contrast, the bottom half of the distribution, of the economic distribution in the US for 50 years has stagnated. And half of Americans born in 1984 are earning less than their parents were at the same age. I think in that environment, there is a lot of resentment and frustration and animosity that we're measuring by these various other metrics that we're seeing, you know, addiction, suicide rates, et cetera. And it becomes very easy in that situation for demagogues to say, well, the problem is immigrants taking your jobs, or the problem is trade agreements, whatever else. And yeah, my view is indeed that if you want to address these very real problems in working class America, then you do that by investing in early childhood, in education, in addiction treatment programs, in vocational education, and there are a million programs that will have a much more obvious impact and perhaps will make people, will create somewhat greater inclusiveness. Having said that, though, Northern Europe does indeed have many of these same programs that I am preaching for in this country, and Northern Europe has indeed suffered from the same political backlash, has shown the same vulnerability to demagogues, I was really sobered by how much kind of neo-Nazis and the extreme right gained in recent years after the Merkel admission of refugees. I don't have any clear answers to that, but I found that very sobering.
I think we have time for one last question. I apologize because we have a session at 1:15 in Penn Pavilion, so you get the last question.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you for coming, and that this is in no way meant to be antagonistic. I'm just curious, why are you really here tonight, or today? Almost all of our panelists today and yesterday, and I assume the rest of it today, have been white men who aren't particularly a part of the issue, and I'm just wondering what makes your voice particularly important that we should listen to it, and why should we listen to you if you have no real stake in the issue, and what does it say to you that this conversation is dominated by people like me or you?
So I completely take your point that the discussion needs to be more diverse. We need to have all kinds of voices. So I don't know what other voices have been here. I mean, I'm here because I was invited to come. And if you're asking, would I have invited me to come? That's a more complicated question, and I don't have a good answer to that.
Would you have accepted knowing that the panelists, for the most part, have been white men?
Look, I believe in coming. I mean, I'm glad I came to Duke. Do I regret coming to Duke? No. Should panels in general be? I'm not going to speak on the context. I don't know what the panels were, but do we need panels and discussions and that are diverse in terms of gender, in terms of background, in terms of class, in terms of race, et cetera? Absolutely, and we need broader voices. Having said that, though, it is also important for everybody, including white men who were born in the U.S., to speak out about immigration. I think one of the lessons we've learned over the last 50 years is that if only an affected community speaks out about the issues that concern them, then we get nowhere. And the Holocaust wasn't just a Jewish issue. Civil rights weren't just a black issue. And when families are being separated at the border, that is not just a Latino issue. That is an issue that should affect every American of every complexion, gender, and everything else. So in that sense, that's an obligation for all of us.
Thank you.